Balancing and making interesting skills is at the heart of any kind of RPG-based game, and I've been running into some issues looking at Limbus Company, which framed today's video, as we're talking about building creative builds and skills and kills and any other ills that we can think of. Skill design, build variants, and so on have been essential aspects of JRPG, CRPG, and any kind of RPG design over now 40 years. And it's something that has changed a lot in terms of methodology and kind of the general philosophy of how you want to build these games out. It's a major part of Shameless Promo, my upcoming book on RPG design. When we talk about how skills have evolved, it's gone from being a very quantitative experience. We're going to let you build a character of 500 active skills, 300 passive skills. You can decide whether they specialize in French cuisine or they're good at making diner food. And all this will impact when you fight the final god at the end of the game. But as we've seen, more doesn't equal better when it comes to skill design, especially if bosses are immune to eating cheeseburgers or having pizza. And when we kind of began to see this evolution of RPG design in the late 2000s through to the 2010s, more and more games have been cutting back on a lot of the padding of RPGs. Again, today, an 80 to 100 hour long RPG is not exactly as great of a marketing point as it was 30 years ago. But with skills in themselves, the idea when you're trying to create interesting choices and unique abilities for your game has to revolve around what the player is trying to achieve. And here's a pop quiz for game designers out there. Which one of these choices sounds better to you? Fire, ice, or lightning damage? Let me know in the comments down below. The answer to that question is none of the above, because I told you literally nothing about what those choices mean. I could have said, do you want 67 whiz slizzlers or 87 bang jammers? And I was coming up with, or inventing wars while I was recovering from my COVID vaccine, so I don't know if I actually said anything, or if I just insulted everyone using some kind of long forgotten slang. And I do apologize if I just said something incredibly offensive to everyone watching. The point is that in order for a choice to matter, it has to bring something to the table. There's only so many levers you can pull as a designer based on your combat system, your skill system, and so on. And the ARPG genre is a good example of this kind of going in the wrong direction. When you look at kind of modern ARPGs today, your Grim Dawns, Path of Exiles, Diablos, and so on, they've kind of reduced a lot of what makes some of the more interesting skills viable. And Path of Exile may be the best example where it has done things right, in that the different kinds of damage have their own sense of personality to them. For anyone who's played Path of Exile, you know that there's a difference between using claws, the staff, clubs, swords, axes, shields, whatever you want. And then that is further translated into different kinds of damage. Fire damage can leave fiery trails. Ice damage can freeze. This is really good stuff. But what we saw with like Diablo and Grim Dawn, especially in some of the later incarnations of Diablo, is that everything is reduced down to damage. So when I say fire, ice, lightning, burning, freezing, whatever, in Diablo, that just means you want damage, 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 or damage. Incidentally, it's the same thing with Grim Dawn. When we look at the myriad of different modifiers and skill descriptions in that game, you have, okay, this will do fire damage, burning damage, ice damage, freezing damage, poison damage, disease damage, darkness damage, light damage. blunt, pierce, slash damage. There's a lot of different kinds of damage. But at the end of the day, the damage itself doesn't really give itself any kind of personality. It's just numbers on top of numbers. And the problem with numbers is that there is a very simple issue with them. Only one number will be the highest. And this is an oftentimes issue we see when developers try to create choices. But if you don't provide enough mechanisms for how things can be different, then it's just not really doing much. You see, it all comes back to a very simple question. How does the player win? And again, the most common answer to that question is with damage. If I do more damage than the enemy dies, they can't hurt me. There we go, simple answer. There's our game design lesson for the day. But as I just said a minute ago, if you have 30 different damage dealing skills, and one of them is flat out superior to everything else, what's the point of the other 29 skills? And this is an issue that Limbus Company has with its skill design. They keep adding in different kinds of skills in this game, or different kinds of damage types. You have right now bleeding, sinking, tremor, rupture, probably a few other ones that I'm forgetting at the moment. And again, for those of you watching this in the future, they probably add another 10 to 15 status ailments, probably between the time of this video going up. But you see, here's the problem with this. At the end of the day, in a game like Limbus Company, you need to do damage. Duh. But there are different characters who kind of specialize in different forms of damage. So I try to build a team exclusively around rupture damage. That is, every character in the group has that kind of ailment, or they'll benefit from it. But a lot of those are kind of the 2-star or not the super rare variety characters, so they're innately not as strong as the 3 stars. You see, here's the problem. Building an entire team around a status ailment like this is not doing anywhere near as much cool stuff or being able to do as much damage as a team of just like 6 to 7 of the best characters. And my account at this point has literally every great character. That's not hyperbole. Thanks to the season passes and all that, I have every single top tier character in the game. I can just literally throw money at the problem at this point, or well, I think I threw $10 at the problem, and I can just dominate like that. But you see, because of that, why should I experiment with anything else when I have all these amazing characters who are completely separate? Like, none of them actually like synergize or part of the same faction, but they still just dominate just because of raw power. So some of you may argue, well, if you build it like this, this, and this, you get it in this perfect arrangement, then these characters dominate. But you see, that is the other trap when it comes to skill design. This idea that if it takes so much more work to get to the same level as something else, then it's still not really a viable option. So we're going to go to some video footage that is not part of this channel, and if I get sued from this, I expect everyone to donate at least $100 to my legal fees. But let's watch this. Dun dun dun. Bang. I hope you enjoy the extra sound effects I added. If this video gets 1 million likes, I'll do a cover of Snake Eater, and surely those words won't come back to bite me. But in game design terminology, let's break down what just happened. The henchman had a +7 in Sword Mastery with a DPS of maybe 500, but they need to be within 2 to 3 feet in order to do damage. Indy has a 3 in Firearm Specialization and does 80,000 DPS. Now, unfortunately, he is limited by bullets, but because he's using the Archaeologist set, he regains 2 bullets every 60 seconds, so he's not too worried about that. And this, again, is this quandary that we see when it comes to skill design in games. Yes, you can make all these weird and wild skills, but at the end of the day, if this strategy takes 30 turns to dominate, and this one takes 2, why would I ever go with the larger one? And to return to the original question about how do you facilitate different strategies, the key that you want to look at is that each type of damage or each type of build you have in your game should, in of itself, be incredibly powerful within the right circumstances. This is something that we see from some of the best deck builders, like Slay the Spire, Monster Train, and there's probably a few other ones I'm forgetting. Monster Train in particular is really good at this. Each faction has a kind of specific whammy that they can use to dominate the enemy. The Demon faction can buff their cards. The Nature faction has Thorns or Reflect damage. And we go down the line. Each one is game-breakingly awesome under the right circumstances, and you can build them properly. But not one of them would be considered the be-all, end-all. That one that you should always take. They're all grossly overpowered. But how you get to those states of being overpowered are fundamentally different. To return to Limbus Company, one thing that I would like to see is that the different kinds of ailments that you can throw in that game, that if you get them to like a certain count or a certain level, they should probably give like a secondary effect as well. There has to be something more than just damage. Because again, if that is the only lever you can pull to differentiate your skills, one will always come out on top over everything else. Again, it's another thing that we see from some of the lesser deck builders. If I have a card that costs 1 point and it does 90 to 90 points of damage and defense, and I have another card that is 5 costs and it is 3/4, why the heck should I ever take anything else? And this is where we talk about ways of building diversity in your game. A really good example of this, keeping with the deck building line, is Inscryption. Inscryption is a deck builder, again, like some of the games we mentioned, but it is one that is inherently built on you game breaking it. It's not a question of if I'm going to break that game, but by how much will I dominate, hopefully. And if you're trying to play the game or its roguelike mode on the highest difficulty, you need to destroy that game. Because here's an artist's rendition of what it's like to play the game when they unleash all the bears at you. And Inscryption, again, delivers a really good example of how you can have overpowered ways of playing a game without it completely destroying the balance of your design. Arknights, and in fact, not only Arknights, but a lot of the better gacha-driven games are also really good at providing different characters, different ways of playing the game that if you focus entirely on them, you can just destroy some of the stuff in the game. But again, not any individual skill or individual character is broken or ruins the game by itself. So, returning to Arknights for a second, it is a game where every new 6-star comes with its own unique ability, unique utility, and so on. One of my favorite characters in the game is a 6-star caster who, when we look at the numbers, again, numbers by themselves don't mean much unless we're attaching other things to them. So, if we just focus on the individual numbers, a character that does 900 attack would be better than one that does 500 attack. But when we have a character in a game like Arknights, so this one, their attack set may not be as high as some of the other casters, but they come with the lovely ability to attack at global range. So in a tower defense game, we have to worry about characters appearing anywhere on the map. Having someone who can literally hit anything on the field, no matter where they're located, is really great utility. Is it the be-all, end-all on every single map? Of course not. But this is how you start to create interesting choices, where it's not just about doing one form of damage. And for developers out there, there's many different ways that you can create different forms of damage. We have direct damage, indirect damage, AoE damage, damage over time, counter damage, reflecting damage based off of, let's say, how many pots the character is holding on to at a moment. There's many different ways and many different legitimate ways that you can create interesting choices. But again, the choices have to be beyond just numbers. Should reflect damage be as big of a nuclear option as direct damage? Probably not. But if you can do interesting things with it, such as, let's say, reflect damage pierces armor or cannot be dodged, these are ways of adding additional utility. Darkest Dungeon 2, as one of our final examples, is another good take on this. It is a game built on different kinds of damage. Again, you have direct damage, you have your poison or blight, you have bleed, you have burn. Each one individually is okay. But when you start combining the different quirks, the different artifacts or trinkets, you can get some amazingly broken strategies in Darkest Dungeon 2. I've watched a few people do full-on difficulty runs where no character could die, and they destroyed the game with the right quirks and trinkets. And that, again, is what you want. You want to have the ability for your different options to have these extreme edge cases. To return to the Binding of Isaac as another example, that M.M. McMillan didn't care about whether or not you should be able to combine quad shot with tri-shot, with double shot, with spread shot, with nuclear bomb shot, and just like hit the button and the entire screen explodes. Now, with that said, it does become harder to balance. And this again is the innate challenge of creating interesting and different skills and builds in your games. The more builds you have, the more things that need to be working or aligned in order for all of them to remain viable. The worst thing you can do in a situation like this is say, okay, here's 10 different kinds of ways of playing our game, only 2 of them actually count in terms of being able to win. And you need to be, again, very mindful of how each element of your game will interact with one another. As we've said throughout this video, damage is the most popular way of building something because it is the simplest way. Hit something very hard, you get a very big number. But if you have one kind of damage that, let's say when the enemy is hit by it, it completely removes all their armor and defense, that's going to sound really great, and it's going to sound better than anything else in your game if it is the only thing that does additional kinds of utility. And again, this is why if you're going to go the utility route, you want everything to have its own form of utility. In the right or the most optimal circumstance, each and every form of your builds and your skills should be overpowered. What you don't want, again, is for it to be, I get one skill, I become the god of death, your entire game is broken. You want to have all these different elements that can build towards this. So if, let's say, the character gets the ice comb, the ice belt buckle, the ice hat, so that now, anytime they hit an enemy with an ice-based attack, the enemy will automatically freeze. Every time the enemy gets frozen, the player recovers health. Every time the player recovers health, it spreads ice to all nearby enemies. If an enemy is killed while frozen, they do like an ice explosion that freezes more enemies, which will then recover more health, which will then cause more freeze. And suddenly we get into the situation where the entire game is snowballing. No pun intended with the ice-related perks. And this is what you want the player to feel. that they have somehow discovered the super secret combination that a developer could have never thought of, and now the game is over. But you see, the chance of the player getting into that same situation, run after run, game after game, should be very minuscule. There should be other game-breaking strategies. Again, you don't want it to be a case of 1 out of a million runs will actually have a build that can win. But you also don't want it to be every run I get a broken strategy that completely dominates and I just close my eyes and the game is on easy mode. It's a very finely tuned balance you have to walk between giving the player the capacity to break the game and allowing them to just flat out break the game. And when you build your game around, again, this idea that the player will stumble upon broken strategies, rather than you flat out telling them, it leads to being far more rewarding. This idea that the player connects those dots, that if this skill does damage over time, and this thing procs over every time the enemy takes damage, I can put these two together and create a very powerful combination. And when games become that rewarding, it leads to greater depth, and again, it leads to greater diversity in ways of playing it beyond just make big number get bigger. And if your game is just only about making a big number bigger, it can only get so big before people just stop caring about how many powers to 10 this thing is actually hitting. So to wrap things up for the video, can you think of games that we haven't mentioned yet in this video that did a fantastic job of creating wildly different builds that all feel overpowered and great, but are still fundamentally different from one another? Let me know in the comments down below. That's going to do it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to do the YouTubing stuff people tell you to do. If you're interested in more of my thoughts on design, check out my books wherever they are sold. Visit our Discord and Patreon, and come back for discussions on game design here, and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games.